Welcome to this talk. My name is Alex Lamprecht and I work at Create in Singapore. Today we're talking about a topic which I've been working on in the last couple of years with the title of Random Forest Regression of Charge Balancing Data. And we're doing this as a state of health estimation method for electric vehicle batteries. So first of all, there's a lot to unpack here. We have first electric vehicle batteries. So this gives a scope on what you're looking at. It's not only electric vehicle batteries, also actually just any large-scale battery, lithium-ion battery pack application would be possible to use this with. State of health estimation method, that's like the interesting base of this entire problem. What do we mean by state of health estimation? How do we do that? In order to facilitate the state of health estimation method, we'll be using charge balancing data. We will get to this in a minute. What is charge balancing and what is the data we can receive from that? And in order to extract our data here, we will use random forest regression in order to give an actual estimation, online estimation over here. First of all, how can we determine the health of a lithium-ion battery cell? Most of you are aware that lithium-ion cells age over time, so they degrade. Everyone probably has noticed this in their smartphone. You buy a smartphone, you plug it in, you charge it. It can last for a really long time. But after a while, after a year or two, the capacity of your battery noticeably drops. So you barely get a day out of use of it, and you have to replace it or replace the battery. So what's happening here? What's happening is what we call battery aging. This is basically, in order to talk about this, we talk about health or state of health. But how can we measure this? So if I would give you a battery cell, a lithium-ion battery cell, you would have a hard time to tell me the state of health of this, because the only thing you can do is actually look from the outside. I mean, you could open it and look on the inside under the microscope, and you could tell me exactly what the state is, but that would destroy the cell, and we don't want to do that. So what can you do? So of course you can measure the electrical properties. So you can look at the voltage, for example, with a multimeter here. So you can see this one, for example, is 4.2 volts. This gives us an idea about the technology that may be used, but in and of itself, it doesn't say a whole lot. So we can measure the current. Of course, if you operate a battery cell, there will be a current, so you can measure that. We can measure ambient parameters like the temperature. That's quite important. And that one, what else we can measure with our simple multimeter here is the ohmic resistance. So you can see what's the internal resistance of a battery cell. And that may actually give us an idea about state of health of the battery cell. Another thing we can do is measure the complex resistance or the impedance. We cannot do that with a simple multimeter, so we need to apply a current pulse over a range of frequencies. And based on the response we get from our battery cell, we can see how the cell responds to different frequencies. And generally, the idea is that these various frequencies correspond to different mechanisms which happen inside a cell. So a lithium-ion battery cell is an electrochemical energy storage system. And what happens here is that your energy is stored in a way that puts lithium ions into a crystal, intercalation as it's called. Okay, what does health of a battery cell actually mean? If you look on a physical level, on the hardware of the actual cell, there are mechanisms at play that degrade the cell over time. So as we earlier said, we intercalate the lithium ions into the grid of our electrodes. And what happens over time is that if you push a lithium ion into this crystal, this puts a lot of mechanical stress on the electrodes. And over time, if you do that many, many times, bring in the ions, take out the ions, this will crack, and literal parts can fall off. And this degrades active material and contributes to the capacity loss in our battery cell. There's another mechanism at play which reduces the power you can draw from a battery cell. That's the internal resistance. So that's basically the two metrics we have in order to determine the health of our battery cell. Now, it's for one the capacity, and for one the internal resistance. So now that we know that what happens if battery cell ages, we need to look at the factors like where does aging actually come from? And there's multiple various factors at play. One which is basically unavoidable is calendric aging, meaning if you just have your cell sit on a shelf for a while, it will degrade. So the thing, it will not do that linearly. It depends on various factors, for example, the storage time. The longer you let it sit on your shelf, the more it degrades. but it also depends on which state of charge or SOC the cell actually sits at. A higher SOC will usually make it degrade faster. And the same is for temperature. If you store your battery cell at a lower temperature, it will degrade slower than when you store it at a higher temperature. So besides that, aging also comes from usage, cyclic aging. So when you actually use your cell and cycle it, that will contribute to the deterioration of your cell material here. But this is also not applicable just in a vacuum. It will depend on the number of cycles you actually use it for, the depth of discharge or DOD. If you cycle your cell for 20% all the time, let's say you discharge it from 80 to 60% and recharge it to that thing, that has an impact, or if you discharge it completely. But also at what SOC you do the cycling. For example, if you discharge from 80 to 20%, it's worse than when you discharge from 60 to 40%, even though it's the same amount of energy you withdraw. So there's a lot of factors in play. It's all very, very linearly. So then you have manufacturing differences. Like, how is the cell manufactured? Is there like slight variations in the cell material? Is the electrolyte mixture slightly different? So you have variations in the composition, the environment during manufacturing. Is there any impurities introduced into the cell? That can have an impact on the aging. And then, of course, you have environmental factors outside: temperature, humidity, seasonal changes. If you use your cell in different climates, for example, if you use it in a climate which has very pronounced seasons, the aging will be different over the year. So traditionally in literature, the SOH, or state of health, is defined as one number from 0 to 100%. And typically the end of a lifetime of a battery cell is defined by its end of life criterion. And normally that says when the capacity is dropped to 75 or 80%, and you say the cell is dead on capacity terms, or if the internal resistance doubles, then you can define the cell as dead for power usage. So of course there's still usable capacity, and the battery cell can still use it. It's just not as useful anymore as in the beginning. And you say, typically you say, then it has reached its end of life. So we split this SOH actually up into two components, one for the capacity and one for the resistance, using these end of life criterions, as you can see on the right side in these equations. And these are normed to an area from 0 to 1, meaning SOH of 1 means 100%, like a fresh cell. The SOH of 0 means it has reached its end of life criterion. You can add these SOHs together in a weighted fashion, as you can see over here. Depending on your application, you can put more emphasis if the capacity or the internal resistance is more important to you. So one result of this aging is that not all battery cells in a battery pack age equally. And as you know, if you have a smartphone, there's only one cell in there. It doesn't matter how that actually ages. But if you have a huge battery pack with many, many thousand cells, like in modern electric vehicles, for example, these cells may not age exactly at the same rate. And this may introduce differences in the state of charge over time. And this will actually get worse over time. So if you have a weaker cell or more aged cell, this will charge and discharge quicker than the other ones. And since you have to stop charging or discharging when the first cell reaches empty or full, you may not use the entire capacity of your battery pack. So what you want to do over time is charge balancing. So on this slide on the left side, we can see we have a starting distribution of SOCs for various cells, which are connected in series. And the industry standard approach right now is passive charge balancing. So basically you add a resistance in parallel to each cell with a switch, and on demand you can just thermally dissipate the excess charge you have here. That works. That's cheap and easy and simple to do. But the problem here is that this is not ideal because you will lose energy. So recently there has been a shift to more advanced solutions, namely active charge balancing, where the excess energy from one cell will be transferred to a cell which requires it and with a lower SOC. And this is way more efficient, so you don't dissipate any energy as heat. There's two methods to do that. One is neighbor only, where you can only transfer charge between adjacent cells, and then the other one is non-neighbor, where you can transfer charge directly from one cell to any cell in the battery pack. Of course, these require different circuitry in order to facilitate this, and we will only focus on the most advanced one, non-neighbor, because that's where the most interesting algorithms are going to be. Okay, our next step was to think about how can we obtain data about battery aging. So ideally you would have a huge array of physical battery packs sitting somewhere and cycling through them, doing all sorts of measurements all the time over years until they reach the end of life. But of course, this is not viable for a test environment as we have. So we came up with a simulation framework which is able to simulate an entire battery pack from the cell level all the way up to a vehicle and an environment model. What we have in blue here is our cells, which encompasses the model of a physical cell, like how it would react electrically. We have the balancing unit, which is attached to every cell, which conducts the balancing. And we have communication between the cells. So we are looking at this particular cell model where each and every cell is equipped with a tiny microcontrollers, and instead of having one global BMS, we have a small BMS on each and every cell. So this requires particular algorithms, but in general it should work like a standard BMS with active cell balancing. In the center we have the cell management unit, which facilitates all the balancing and the communication between the cells. And this is basically our battery cell. So we have many of these cells in a battery pack. And around these cells, we've added an aging module. So here in orange, you can see. So this aging module is actually takes data from an empirical aging study and applies it to the battery cells with slight variations, of course. So every cell has its own aging model and ages according to this empirical measured model. This data comes from a study which looked at lithium-ion battery packs actually over the entire lifetime. So the data they have is realistic. So this battery pack sits inside a vehicle model. So we've modeled a Tesla Model S here, and on this Tesla Model S we can apply different scenarios. So these scenarios consist of different driving profiles. So we can apply a WLTP or whatever driving profile you want to use your car at. It automatically calculates the current demand for your battery pack. Then we have can apply charging profiles. Like in what way do you want to charge your battery pack? Fast charging, slow charging, overnight, however you feel like. Then we also apply a temperature profile depending on where you plan to apply your vehicle. So on the other hand, we have the communication observer, which means this logs all the balancing data and charging data and everything the battery management system communicates and sends it to a data logger. So this is what we base our model on. So a bit more detail about the aging model we've implemented. This is a model based on publication from Schmalstieg, where they looked at battery cells over their entire lifetime and concluded this set of equations, which the capacity and the internal resistance follows. And based on these equations, the momentum is SOHC and SOHR according to our model calculate. So what's the data we're actually logging? So for every battery pack, we have cells. So our battery pack has 96 cells in series and 74 cells in parallel. And for each cell pack, which is parallel at each module, we log the data. So we log voltage, we log temperature, SOHC, SOHR, which we calculate, of course, but also the live SOC. And we do that over the entire lifetime. So you can imagine there's quite a few data points. So if you had a look at this data, so basically we have from our model, we have on the one hand the current, the voltage, the SOC, basically the stuff we can measure. And on the other hand, we have the underlying parameters we've implemented, the actual state of health. So the battery itself is not aware of its state of health. It just is used as the foundation for its behavior, calculation of its behavior. So we found in the analysis here is that no single feature, like be it the voltage, be it the current, be it the internal resistance, has a direct correlation to the absolute SOH. But what we found is very interesting. We found a strong correlation between delta N and the SOH for each balancing process. What is delta N in that point? So you can imagine if you do the balancing, there's not one balancing step which immediately equalizes all battery cells. So what you do is you take a tiny bit of charge from one cell with a higher SOC and bring it to a cell with a lower SOC. And once you've done that, you check again and determine like what's the next step. And you do hundreds of these steps in order to basically converge to an equilibrium. If you look at this kind of balancing behavior, you can think of maybe a cell which participates in more charge balancing processes strays further from the average than the other ones. And this is exactly what we found. On the right side, you can see our delta N. This is the number of balancing processes a cell has participated in. And below that, you can find the SOH for the capacity. And if we graph this over each other, as you can see as a low link, we have a very, very strong correlation. So the only problem here is that this line highly depends on the SOC, like the state of charge you actually do it. You can imagine if you do balancing where the pack is quite full, then the weakest cells are actually the ones which are the fullest. So I mean, in order to equalize your battery pack there, you have to take charge from them. But if you do balancing at a low SOC, then the weakest cells, which used to be the fullest, are now the emptiest because their overall capacity is reduced the most. And then this curve actually inverts. And in between, like if you do this balancing at 50% SOC, then this curve is actually flat, and you can't extract any meaningful information whatsoever. So to mitigate this problem, we actually looked at the SOC, or more specifically at the voltage, because the SOC is somewhat correlated to the voltage. And we have divided our N here by the delta V, like the difference in voltage from before and after the balancing process. So, and what that gives us is basically you can see how much each balancing step changes the voltage of your battery cell. Of course, every balancing step in itself just only changes the voltage in a tiny amount. It's barely measurable. So that's why we do it over the entire balancing process. And we found that there's a very, very strong correlation here. If the SOC is in the middle range, then this curve gets flat and we can't extract all that much information here. So in our data pre-processing, we've extracted the ones which are below 60% and above 75%. And then we've only looked at the cells with the maximum number of messages, because you can imagine the ones which have not participated in many balancing steps whatsoever maybe were already at the average SOC which we are targeting. So what we receive is this. So it's our gamma down here, our number of balancing steps over delta V. And we plotted the SOHC over it. And you can see we have two distinct bands. So the color code means at which SOC level this has been performed. And we can see there's a very, very strong correlation. However, we have these two bands, so we somehow need to universalize this with the SOC. And what we found is if we do this over an entire balancing cycle, not only one balancing process where we equalize once, but over a balancing cycle, meaning we summarize all balancing processes over one charge-discharge cycle. So for example, you can see I have a SOHC on the left side. We discharge, maybe do balancing in between, and once we charge again, then we basically conclude the balancing cycle. We summarize all these gammas which we retrieve from these balancing processes and weigh them with a beta, with a factor which is a function of the SOC. Yeah, and we're doing this for the strongest and the weakest cell, high and low. And in order to get this value for every cell in between, we weight it with this factor down here. And this gives us, after each and every balancing cycle, a very, very strong a value which is very, very strong correlated to the SOHC. So now that we have all this data, we have our voltage, we have our current, we have our temperature, we have our resistance, and we have the number of balancing steps and our gamma, which we just defined for each and every cell over its entire lifetime. Now we can fit our models, and we've looked at two possibilities to do that. One is linear regression, where we just try to fit a line through our points. And the other one is regression tree, so a bit of machine learning. And what's a regression tree? So a regression tree basically takes our sample data, divides it on some criterion into a binary tree. And we keep doing that, dividing our data into nodes and dividing our nodes even further via criteria, which we define on our input data. And in the end, we have bin data, depending on the depth of our tree, of course, more or less granular. And we take all the average of the resulting values, and that's basically the value which sits at the end of all the branches of our trees. So, of course, you can say if we only do that with one tree, this will not be very precise for every other application. So that's why we do the random forest, where we take multiple of these trees, and we average about over their values what they spit out. So the training for our model we've done with the Python machine learning suite scikit-learn. We split our pre-processed data into three sets. One is the training data, one for validation, and one for test. So as you can see, we've simulated 16 scenarios where we varied the drive cycle, the usage pattern, the temperature, the climate. And we've calculated 4 distinct battery packs or vehicles for each scenario with a random starting distribution of battery parameters and aging parameters. So the training was done on 36 of these battery packs. And the validation was done on a completely different set for these scenarios. What you can see over here is that we split our data from our test data in a way that we apply scenarios that the machine learning model has never seen before. So completely different usage case, and so it is quite new for it. Okay, now let's have a look at the results. First, we look at our results for the linear regression. On the left side graph, you can see the results for the SOHC over the entire lifetime of the battery pack. And on the right side, you can see the results for the SOHR of the lifetime. We are displaying here two different battery packs, meaning two different scenarios as well. One where the battery pack is used less and aged slower. These are the blue and black lines, which indicate the maximum and minimum SOH of the battery pack. And the orange and green lines represent a battery pack which aged quicker, which you can see on the left side. The SOHC reached 0 at roughly 2000 days in, while the black and blue battery pack lived quite longer. So the scattered values in our plots are our estimation, and the solid lines are the actual values. And we can see we're not that far off, particularly on the left side for the SOHC, we're quite good. The issue comes when we look at the SOHR. Our estimation is way off. It's all over the place. It has these weird ripples in there where it maybe takes too much of the temperature values which we provide, and the estimation doesn't work as well for that. Okay, if we look at the root mean square errors we get over here for our SOHC on the left side, we can see it's quite good. We're only 1.82% off. But for the SOHR, you can see the relative occurrence curve is way flatter, and we have an error of 6.23%. Okay, how does the random forest regression perform compared to this? On the left side, again, we have the SOHC, and we see the results are very, very similar. We have a few more outliers when it comes to the black line and the green line, like the lower level, where towards the end, the aging is sometimes the estimation is quite off. But for the SOHR, we can see it performs way better. Yeah? So it's way closer to our actual data. And we can also see this in our error bars here. On the left side, the SOHC is almost the same, slightly worse than linear regression, but for the SOHR, we're way better. So we can see the random forest approach performs better than easy linear regression in that regard. So next, we've also compared our results to similar approaches we found in literature. Yeah? So the difference here was that most of these approaches just used simple data you can measure, like the voltage, internal resistance, and not our balancing data. Some of these papers use the same data set, a data set about battery cell aging, which is provided by NASA, which is publicly available. So what does these results say? Yeah? So most of the previous results found in literature only looked at the SOHC, or basically defined the SOH as only consisting of the capacity. We only found one where it was also including the internal resistance. And we can see our estimation method for the SOHC is up there. Yeah? So since the other publications don't factor in this balancing data, we get an additional benefit from this. And you can see it's quite significant. It performs better than anything we found. So for the internal resistance, we had one publication which was closer than ours, but yeah, with our machine learning random forest approach, we're not so far off here. So overall, we're quite close. Okay, where do we go from here? Yeah, so this was just the estimation phase. We've proven that our model follows the realistic behavior in terms of SOH quite closely. And our next step would be to actually feed this back in our model and do something with it. For example, these calculations, of course, may not be viable to be done on the battery pack itself. So maybe you transmit this data somewhere else, maybe to the cloud, maybe to a computer which already exists in an electric vehicle, do these calculations there and feed the SOH estimation back to the battery management system. So why is that good? This, for example, could help to do predictive maintenance. If you see that one cell ages faster than another one, you could use it less in order to prolong your battery life. Or, as in a different paper we've been talking about, you can do preconditioning, basically condition your battery pack in a way that it maximizes your use for the next use cycle. So that was so much from my talk. Thank you so much for listening. Here's my references, and here's some publications that have been written if you want to learn more about this kind of things. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.